Tonight we're diving into the dark and chilling world of Pinehurst, Washington, a small, isolated town hidden deep in the Cascade Mountains. In this video, we'll uncover 6 most disturbing true horror stories from this seemingly peaceful place, stories that will make you rethink ever hiking alone, especially on the infamous Trail 19, from unexplainable disappearances and eerie red markers leading hikers astray, to ghostly encounters that blur the line between the living and the dead. Pinehurst holds secrets buried deep within its forested trails. If you think you've heard all there is to the horror genre, think again. These stories from Pinehurst are enough to keep you up at night. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories. Sarah Mitchell, though that isn't her real name, made a decision in late September of 2021 that would change her life forever. For reasons that will become clear, certain details about this story have been changed to protect her identity. But what happened to her on that trail happened exactly as we're about to describe. She was 26 years old, recently divorced, and desperately in need of a fresh start when she moved to Pinehurst, Washington, a small town of 1,847 people nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains, about 40 miles from the nearest city. It's one of those places most people have never heard of unless they're serious hikers. The town exists almost entirely because of the national forest that surrounds it. When Sarah saw the job posting for an assistant manager position at the local outdoor supply store, it felt like fate. The pay was decent, the cost of living was low, and most importantly, it was 2,000 miles from her ex-husband. Sarah had always been a hiker, not hardcore, not summiting major peaks, but she loved those 8 to 12 mile day hikes that left you pleasantly exhausted and filled with endorphins. Pinehurst seemed like paradise for someone like her. The store's owner, a weathered man in his 60s named Frank, told her during the interview that there were over 30 trails within a 20-minute drive. "You picked the right town," Frank said, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. Then he paused, drumming his fingers on the desk. Sarah laughed, thinking he was joking. Frank's expression didn't change. He wasn't laughing. Trail 19, we call it the Ridge Point Trail officially, but locals just call it Trail 19. Beautiful views, not too difficult. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Don't ever hike it alone?" Sarah asked, intrigued despite herself. "Little pieces of red cloth tied to trees. They're not official trail markers. Those are yellow and blue." He shook his head slowly. "Just trust me." Sarah nodded, more curious than concerned. Every town has its local legends, she thought. Frank seemed nice but eccentric. She figured the cursed trail was just a story they told to tourists or newcomers. That first month in Pinehurst was everything Sarah needed. She hiked almost every day after work, exploring different trails, taking photographs, breathing in that crisp mountain air that smelled like pine and possibility. The locals were friendly, the scenery was breathtaking, and she was finally starting to feel like herself again. Sarah specifically avoided Trail 19 for the first 6 weeks, not because she believed Frank's warning, but because she was systematically working through the other trails first. But on a perfect Saturday morning in early November, the last weekend before snow would make higher elevation trails dangerous, she decided it was time to check out the infamous Trail 19. She mentioned her plan to Frank on Friday evening as she was closing up the store. His face went pale. "Sarah, please don't." "It's fine," she assured him with the confidence of someone who'd hiked alone dozens of times. Frank grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "I'm serious." Sarah gently pulled away, uncomfortable with the intensity in his eyes. "I appreciate the concern, but I'll be careful." Frank looked like he wanted to say more, but he just shook his head and walked away. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that makes the Pacific Northwest famous. Sarah started the Ridge Point Trail just after 7 a.m., wanting to finish before the afternoon clouds rolled in. The trailhead was empty, which wasn't unusual for November, but she did notice something odd. There were at least a dozen cars parked in the main lot near the more popular trails, but not a single vehicle at the Trail 19 access point except hers. The first 2 miles were spectacular. The trail wound through old-growth forest, massive Douglas firs creating a cathedral of green overhead. Morning sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. Sarah passed a small waterfall, crossed 2 wooden bridges over crystal-clear streams, and climbed gradually through switchbacks that weren't too challenging. She didn't see any other hikers, not one. That struck her as slightly strange. It was perfect hiking weather. but she enjoyed the solitude. At mile 3, Sarah reached a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. Pinehurst looked like a toy town from this height, tiny buildings clustered around a main street. She stopped to eat an energy bar and take some photos. That's when she noticed the first red marker. It was tied to a pine tree about 20 feet off the trail. A strip of faded red cloth, maybe 8 inches long, knotted around a low branch. Sarah walked closer to examine it. The fabric looked old, weathered by seasons of rain and sun, but the knot was tight and deliberate. Sarah looked up the trail ahead. She was only halfway through the hike. The ridge point itself, supposedly the most beautiful part, was still another hour away. The sun was shining. She felt great, and turning around because of a piece of old cloth seemed ridiculous. She decided to keep going. That was her first mistake. As Sarah continued climbing through the forest, she noticed more red markers. They appeared every few hundred yards, always off to the side of the main path, never on it, tied to trees at roughly the same height. She counted 7 of them over the next mile. Something else began bothering her: the silence. When she'd first started hiking that morning, the forest had been alive with sound. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the normal ambient noise of a healthy ecosystem. But now there was nothing, just her footsteps on the trail and her own breathing. At mile 4.5, the trail opened onto the ridge point itself. Frank had been right about one thing: the view was incredible. Sarah could see for miles in every direction. Mountain peaks dusted with early snow, endless forest stretching to the horizon, a distant lake glittering in the sunlight. She was standing there, taking it all in, when she heard the whistle. It came from somewhere behind her, back down the trail she'd just climbed. A long, low whistle, the kind as someone might use to call a dog. Sarah turned around, expecting to see another hiker with a pet. No one was there. She called out. Her voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. Silence. Then the whistle came again, but this time from a different direction, off to her left, somewhere in the thick forest beyond the trail. Sarah's heart started beating faster. Another whistle answered from her right, then one from behind her. They were surrounding her, these whistles, coming from multiple directions, overlapping, creating an impossible chorus. Sarah grabbed her bear spray with shaking hands. Bears don't whistle, she thought. People whistle. But who or what would be out here in the forest, off the trail, making these sounds? The whistling stopped as abruptly as it had started. Sarah stood frozen on that ridge for a full 2 minutes, waiting, listening, nothing but that eerie silence she'd noticed earlier. This was stupid, she decided. She was alone on a trail she'd been explicitly warned about, possibly being stalked by something she couldn't see. Whatever was happening, she didn't want to stick around to find out more. Sarah started back down the trail, walking quickly but not quite running, trying to maintain control and not panic. But every few minutes, she'd hear it again. That long, low whistle, always from somewhere just out of sight in the forest. After about 20 minutes of fast walking, Sarah came to a section of trail she didn't remember. It looked similar. Same kind of forest, same general direction, but something felt fundamentally wrong. She pulled out her GPS device. According to the GPS, she was still on Trail 19, heading toward the trailhead. But Sarah didn't recognize this part. There was a fallen log across the path that she was certain she hadn't stepped over on her way up. The trees looked different somehow, arranged in patterns that seemed unnatural. That's when she noticed that the red markers were everywhere now, dozens of them, tied to trees all around her, forming a perimeter around this section of trail like a warning or a boundary marking something dangerous. Sarah started jogging, fighting down rising panic. Her GPS said she was headed the right way. She just needed to get back to her car, get out of here, and never come back. The whistling followed her, always keeping pace. Whenever she sped up, it seemed to speed up too. When she slowed down to catch her breath, it would come closer, just beyond the nearest trees. Then she heard the footsteps, not animal footsteps, human footsteps, multiple sets of them moving through the forest parallel to the trail. Sarah couldn't see anyone, but she could hear them clearly. Branches breaking, leaves crunching, heavy feet on forest floor, always staying just out of sight. Sarah screamed into the forest. The footsteps stopped. The whistling stopped. Everything went silent. Then she heard a voice calling her name. Sarah! Her blood turned to ice. How did they know her name? Her real name. They were using her actual full legal name that she hadn't shared with anyone in town. Sarah. The voice sounded wrong. It had a strange quality to it, almost like multiple people speaking in unison, slightly out of sync, creating an unsettling echo. Sarah ran. She didn't care about looking brave or maintaining control anymore. She just ran, her backpack bouncing against her spine, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The GPS said she was a mile from the trailhead. She could make it. She just had to keep running. But the trail kept changing. She'd round a bend and find herself in a part of the forest that seemed subtly different from what she'd seen before. The GPS insisted she was on the right path, but her instincts screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. That's when Sarah saw the first one. Standing between two large trees about 50 yards ahead, right on the trail, was a figure, human-shaped, but something about it was wrong. It was too tall, maybe 7 feet, and it stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that was palpable even at that distance. Sarah skidded to a stop. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the path. She heard movement behind her and spun around. Another figure, also impossibly tall, also perfectly still, had appeared on the trail about 40 yards back. They were herding her, trapping her between them. Sarah's mind raced. She looked at the forest on either side of the trail. Dense undergrowth, thick trees, no clear path. If she tried to go off trail, she'd get lost even faster. But staying on the trail meant approaching one of these things. She made a split-second decision and stepped off the trail to her right, pushing through underbrush, trying to move parallel to the trail while giving the figures a wide berth. That's when Sarah noticed something extraordinary. The red markers were leading her. They formed a path through the forest like breadcrumbs, steering her away from the trail but in a general downward direction. She didn't have a choice. She followed the red markers. The markers led Sarah through sections of forest that seemed older, darker, stranger than anything she'd seen before. She passed trees with unusual carvings in their bark, symbols she didn't recognize. She saw more of those two tall figures standing motionless in the distance, but they didn't approach. They just watched. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah stumbled onto a small dirt road. Her GPS told her she was about 2 miles from where she'd parked, but this road would eventually lead back to the main highway. She started running down the road, her legs burning, her lungs screaming. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. A pickup truck came around a bend, and Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. She flagged it down desperately, and an elderly local couple stopped. Sarah could only nod, too exhausted and terrified to speak. "Get in," his wife said, her voice gentle but firm. They drove Sarah back to the trailhead parking lot in silence. Her Jeep was still there, exactly where she'd left it, but pinned under her windshield wiper was a piece of red cloth. Sarah grabbed it with trembling hands. The couple waited until she was in her car with the doors locked before they drove away. That warning hadn't been there when she'd started her hike that morning. Sarah drove back to Pinehurst in a daze. She went straight to Frank's house. He'd given her his address on her first day, saying she could call any time if she needed anything. Sarah told him everything. When she finished, Frank was quiet for a long moment. "You were lucky," he finally said. "The red markers, they're put there by people who escaped. It's a warning system, but it's also a map. If you follow them, they can lead you out." Sarah's voice cracked. Frank's expression was grim. Over the last 30 years, 14 people have gone missing on Trail 19. All experienced hikers, all went alone. Search and rescue never found any trace of them. Sarah whispered, "Nobody knows, or if they do, they're not talking. The Forest Service has tried to officially close the trail twice, but it keeps getting reopened. There are legal complications." Frank shook his head. "The town just tells people to stay away. Those figures I saw—" "Don't try to explain them," Frank interrupted. "Don't try to rationalize it. Some places aren't meant for us. Some places have rules we don't understand. You broke the rule by ignoring the red markers." Sarah moved out of Pinehurst 2 weeks later. She couldn't stay in that town, couldn't sleep knowing that trail was just a few miles away. Frank understood. He even helped her find a job in Seattle before she left. She still hikes today. She hasn't let this experience take that away from her, but she follows the rules now. When she sees signs telling her to stay on designated trails, she listens. When locals warn her about certain areas, she takes them seriously, and she has never ignored a warning marker again. 3 months after Sarah left Pinehurst, Frank called her with news. Another hiker had gone missing on Trail 19, a 34-year-old man from California who'd been warned by multiple people not to go alone. They found his car at the trailhead, his phone inside with the last photo he'd taken, a selfie of him smiling at the start of the trail. In the background of that photo, barely visible among the trees, you can see them, several tall, motionless figures standing just off the trail, watching. The man was never found. Trail 19 is still open today. The Forest Service still hasn't officially closed it, and those red markers are still there, fluttering in the wind, waiting for the next person who thinks they know better than the warnings. If you're a hiker, if you love trails and wilderness and that feeling of freedom that comes from being surrounded by nature, respect the warnings. Not all trails are safe, not all forests are empty, and not all markers are there to guide you deeper in. Some are there to lead you back out, if you're smart enough to follow them. Marcus, a name he still refuses to attach a surname to, was 29 years old in the summer of 2019, completely obsessed with photography. Not professional work, just amateur passion projects that he'd post to Instagram and a small photography blog he maintained. His specialty was abandoned Americana, old gas stations, forgotten motels, ghost towns, the decaying remnants of mid-century America. He'd been planning a Route 66 road trip for years. The old highway, especially the Arizona and New Mexico sections, is legendary among photographers for its abandoned roadside attractions and picturesque ruins. For someone like Marcus, it was paradise waiting to be documented. Marcus set out from Los Angeles in mid-July, planning to spend 2 weeks driving slowly east, stopping at every interesting location he could find. He had a carefully curated list of must-photograph spots he'd compiled from other photographers' blogs and Instagram location tags. The first few days delivered everything he'd hoped for. He shot empty motels with their neon signs still standing, but unlit, rusted gas station pumps at abandoned truck stops, sun-bleached buildings slowly crumbling into the desert. Each location had its own story, its own melancholy beauty. On day 4, Marcus was driving through a particularly empty stretch of Arizona, between the towns of Hackberry and Peach Springs. The landscape was harsh and beautiful. Red rock formations, scrubby desert vegetation, endless sky stretching to every horizon. The temperature was pushing 105 degrees. And he hadn't seen another car in over an hour. That's when Marcus saw it, a small town that wasn't on his map. He'd been using a combination of Google Maps and a physical Route 66 guidebook from 2018. Neither mentioned any town in this area, but there it was, maybe half a mile off the main road, accessible by a cracked 2-lane highway that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. From the distance, Marcus could see buildings, maybe 15 or 20 of them, clustered around what appeared to be a main street. Even from this far away, they had that perfect abandoned aesthetic he was searching for. Several of the structures displayed classic southwestern architecture, flat roofs, stucco walls, covered porches. This was exactly the kind of unexpected discovery that made road trips exciting. Marcus turned onto the cracked access road, his excitement building as he got closer. The buildings were even better than he'd hoped, genuinely old, probably from the 1940s or 50s, in varying states of decay. Some looked like they'd collapsed decades ago, while others were surprisingly intact, as if their residents had simply walked away one day and never returned. There was no welcome sign, no indication of what this town had been called. Marcus parked his car at what looked like it had once been a gas station, 2 rusted pumps standing like sentries in front of a small building with boarded-up windows. He grabbed his camera and started walking down what had been the main street. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no insects, just the crunch of his boots on the sandy ground and the clicking of his camera shutter. The first building Marcus photographed had been a diner. The windows were intact, but so filthy he could barely see inside. He tried the door, locked. Through a gap in the boards covering one window, he could glimpse that the interior was remarkably preserved. Tables still set, menus in holders, a long counter with torn vinyl stools. This place couldn't have been abandoned for more than 30 or 40 years, yet it had the feeling of something much older, almost timeless. Marcus moved down the street methodically, photographing everything. A post office with mail slots still visible, a small general store with faded advertisements painted on the exterior walls, several houses set back from the main road, a building that might have been a schoolhouse. He'd been shooting for maybe 20 minutes when he noticed something odd. In every photograph he'd taken so far, there was a figure. Not the same figure, and not always in the same place, but in each image, if you looked carefully, you could see someone standing in the background, in a doorway, behind a window, around a corner, always distant, always partially hidden, but definitely there. Marcus looked at his camera's LCD screen, scrolling through the images. In one photo of the cafe, there was a person visible through the dirty window, standing inside, facing outward. In a shot of the general store, someone was standing on the covered porch. In an exterior shot of one of the houses, a figure was visible in an upstairs window. But here's what made Marcus's skin crawl. He hadn't seen any of these people when he'd taken the photos. The town had appeared completely empty. These figures only showed up in the images themselves. Marcus looked up from his camera, scanning the town around him. He was standing in the middle of the street, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly. Everything was still, silent, empty. Or was it? He zoomed in on one of the images on his LCD screen, the one with the figure in the cafe window. The figure became clearer when magnified. It appeared to be a woman in what looked like a 1950s-style dress. She was standing completely still, her face pressed against the glass, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at where Marcus had been standing when he took the shot. Marcus felt a cold sensation run down his spine despite the 105-degree heat. He called out. His voice sounded strange in the absolute silence, almost swallowed by the desert air. No response came. Marcus decided to take another photo, this time deliberately aiming at the cafe window where he'd seen the figure. He lined up the shot carefully, focused, and pressed the shutter. Through the viewfinder in that split second, as he took the photo, Marcus saw her. The woman in the 1950s dress, standing inside the cafe, pressed against the window, staring directly at him. He lowered the camera. The window was empty, nobody there. Marcus looked at the image he'd just captured. There she was, clear as day in the photograph, but nowhere to be seen in reality. That should have been his cue to leave. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to get back in his car and drive away. But Marcus was a photographer, and this was impossible, incredible. Whatever was happening, he needed to document it. He started moving through the town more deliberately, taking photos of every building. With each shot, he'd check the LCD screen, and with each shot, there were more figures. They appeared in windows, in doorways, standing in the shadows of covered porches. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothing that looked decades out of date, and they were all looking at the camera, at him. Marcus reached the far end of the town, where the buildings gave way to open desert. There was one last structure here, a small church with a wooden cross on top, leaning at a precarious angle. The door was standing open, almost invitingly. He approached slowly, his camera raised. Through the viewfinder, he could see that the interior was dark, but there was something in there. Movement, shapes. Marcus took the photo. When he looked at the LCD screen, he nearly dropped the camera. The church was full, absolutely packed. Dozens of figures filled the pews, all facing the camera, all perfectly still. And standing in the pulpit at the front was a man in a dark suit, his arms raised like he was in the middle of delivering a sermon. Marcus looked up from the camera. The church appeared empty. He shouted at the building, his voice cracking. For the first time since he'd arrived, Marcus heard a sound, a voice, faint and distant, coming from inside the church. And it wasn't one voice. It was many voices speaking in unison, slightly out of sync, creating an unsettling echo effect that made his stomach turn. Marcus backed away from the church. "I'm leaving. You've taken our photographs. You've seen us." The voices were getting louder, more insistent. "Come inside." Marcus turned and ran. As he sprinted back down the main street toward his car, he could hear doors opening, not just one or two, all of them. Every building in the town was opening up, and he could hear footsteps, dozens of footsteps, emerging onto the street behind him. Marcus didn't look back. He just ran, his camera bouncing painfully against his chest, his breath coming in gasps. He reached his car and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the door. He threw himself inside, started the engine, and floored the gas pedal, spraying gravel as he sped away from that cursed town. Marcus didn't slow down until he reached Peach Springs 20 minutes later. He pulled into a gas station, his heart still hammering, and sat in his car trying to process what had just happened. Then he looked at his camera. He couldn't help himself. He needed to see the images again, to confirm he hadn't imagined what he'd seen. Marcus turned on the camera and started scrolling through the photos he'd taken in that town. They were all there. The buildings, the abandoned streets, the perfect desolation of a ghost town. But the figures were gone. In every single image, the figures that had been standing in windows and doorways had vanished. The church photo showed empty pews. Marcus's hands were shaking as he scrolled through the images. How is this possible? He'd seen them. They'd been there, clear as day in the photographs. Then he reached the last image, the photo he'd taken of the church from the outside. The figures were back, all of them. Hundreds of people crowding out the church door, filling the street, all facing the camera. And in the very center of the crowd, one figure stood out. The man in the dark suit, the one who'd been standing at the pulpit. He was closer to the camera than the others, maybe 10 feet away, looking directly at the lens. In his hand, he was holding something. Marcus zoomed in on the image, his blood turning cold as he realized what it was. The man was holding a photograph, and in that photograph, clear enough to see when Marcus zoomed in further, was an image of him, Marcus himself, standing in the middle of that ghost town, camera raised to his eye. Marcus deleted the entire set of images immediately, all of them. Then he formatted his memory card, erasing everything. He didn't care about losing the other photos from his trip. He just wanted those images gone. He drove straight back to Los Angeles, canceling the rest of his Route 66 adventure. When he got home, Marcus researched the area where he'd found that town, using satellite imagery, historical maps, everything he could access online. There was no town there. The satellite images showed nothing but empty desert where he'd been. Historical maps showed no settlement in that location. As far as he could determine through exhaustive research, no town had ever existed there. But Marcus knows what he saw, he knows where he went, and he knows what showed up in those photographs. 3 days after he got home, Marcus was going through his camera again, making sure all those images were truly deleted. The memory card was empty, just like he'd left it. But when he checked the camera's internal memory, a backup storage feature he'd forgotten the camera even had, there was one image, just one. It was the photograph of the man in the suit, holding the picture of Marcus. But now the man was closer, much closer. The image was zoomed in, as if someone had taken the photo from just a few feet away. And behind him, filling the entire background of the image, were hundreds of faces pressed against windows and standing in doorways, all looking at the camera, all looking at Marcus. He destroyed that camera the same day, smashed it with a hammer, threw the pieces in different dumpsters across the city. Marcus bought a new camera and hasn't been on a photography road trip since. But sometimes, when he's shooting photos around Los Angeles, even just casual street photography, he'll check the images and see something that wasn't there when he pressed the shutter, a figure standing in the background, always distant, always watching. And Marcus knows that someday he's going to take a photograph and see that man in the dark suit again. And the man is going to be closer than before, because when you photograph something, you capture a piece of it. But sometimes, Marcus learned, the thing you photograph captures a piece of you too, and it never quite lets go. David Russo chose to use his real name when he shared the story. He was tired of keeping it secret, and he hoped that maybe someone out there might know something that could help explain what happened to him in the fall of 2020. David had been metal detecting for about 3 years when this incident occurred. It's a hobby many people don't understand. They imagine it's just old men on beaches looking for lost rings. But metal detecting, especially in historical areas, can be genuinely fascinating work. You're essentially doing archaeology, uncovering pieces of the past that have been lost for decades or centuries. David lived in Burlington, Vermont, and he'd detected all over the state. Revolutionary War sites, abandoned homesteads, old fairgrounds, anywhere with historical significance. He followed all the rules meticulously, got permission from property owners, reported significant historical finds to local museums, carefully filled in all his holes. In October of 2020, David met an older gentleman named Arthur Whitmore at a local metal detecting club meeting. Arthur was in his late 70s, a lifelong Vermont resident who'd been detecting since the 1970s. After the meeting, Arthur approached him with an interesting proposition. "You seem like a serious detector," Arthur said, his pale blue eyes studying David carefully. "Someone who respects history. I've got a property I think you'd be interested in." Arthur explained that his family owned a 200-acre tract of forest about 40 miles south of Burlington, near the tiny town of Chimney Point. The land had been in his family since the 1700s and had once been home to a small settlement called Whitmore Hollow. David asked. Arthur's expression darkened. "Fire, disease, deaths, the usual things that kill small settlements. The point is, there are foundations out there, old cellar holes, probably coins and artifacts from multiple centuries. On it, jewelry, metal tags, anything. You stop immediately and bring it to me. Don't dig it up. It was an odd request, but not unreasonable. W were family initials, and Arthur wanted to personally excavate anything related to his ancestors. Deal, David agreed. Arthur gave him a hand-drawn map showing how to reach the property and where the old settlement had been located. He said David could detect there anytime he wanted, and he'd stop by periodically to check on his progress. The following Saturday, David drove out to Whitmore Hollow. The property was stunning, dense forest, rocky outcroppings, and sure enough, once he hiked about half a mile from where he'd parked, he found the settlement remains. There were at least a dozen cellar holes, stone foundations poking up through decades of leaf litter and undergrowth. This place had been a real community once. David spent that first day doing what he called a scout detect, just getting signals, marking interesting targets, mapping out the most promising areas. His detector was going crazy. The whole area was full of metal signals, which made perfect sense for a place people had lived for potentially 100 years or more. Over the next 3 weeks, David returned every Saturday, spending 6 to 8 hours detecting and digging. He found hundreds of items: square nails, colonial-era buttons, pieces of buckles, several large copper coins from the 1790s and early 1800s, broken farm equipment, even part of an old musket lock. It was a metal detectorist's dream come true. W. On his 4th Saturday at the site, David was working an area near what had clearly been a larger house. The cellar hole was bigger than the others, with more elaborate stonework. He got a strong signal and started digging. About 8 inches down, David's pinpointer, a handheld detector for precise location, started screaming. He brushed away the dirt carefully and found it, a small, tarnished silver locket about the size of a quarter. David cleaned it off with water from his bottle. The locket was beautifully made with intricate engraving on the front. W. His heart sank. This was clearly a significant find, probably valuable, definitely historical, but he'd agreed to Arthur's condition. He had to stop and contact him. David marked the exact spot with a surveying flag, took several photographs, and called Arthur's number. Arthur answered on the first ring, W engraved on it. Arthur's voice was sharp, urgent. "Do you understand me? Do not open that locket." David described the location, the larger cellar hole on the eastern end of the settlement. There was a long pause. Then Arthur said, his voice heavy, "That was Joshua Whitmore's house, my great-great-great-grandfather. The locket belonged to his wife Jane. David, I need you to do exactly what I say. Put the locket back exactly where you found it, cover the hole, and leave the property immediately." "Arthur, what's going on? What's so special about—" "Just do as I say. I'm on my way there now." Arthur hung up abruptly. David stood there in the forest, looking at the locket in his hand. It was beautiful. The engraving on the front depicted 2 birds facing each other, despite being buried for probably 180 years. It was in remarkable condition. David shouldn't have done what he did next. He knew he shouldn't, but he was a curious person by nature. It's what made him a good detectorist, and he couldn't help wondering what was inside a locket that Arthur was so desperate to keep closed. David carefully worked his thumbnail into the seam and opened it. Inside were 2 things. On the left was a small miniature portrait, the kind wealthy people commissioned in the early 1800s. It showed a woman, presumably Jane Whitmore, beautiful, with dark hair and serious eyes. On the right was a lock of hair tied with a thread, but the hair was wrong. It wasn't the kind of hair you'd expect in a locket, a token of love from a husband or child. This hair was different, unnaturally dark, almost black. And as David stared at it, the hair seemed to move slightly even though there was no wind. As he watched, the hair began to curl and twist, like something alive. David slammed the locket shut, his hands shaking violently. That's when he heard the scream. It came from somewhere in the forest behind him, a woman's scream, high-pitched and agonized. It went on for several seconds, then cut off abruptly. David called out, "Is someone there?" Silence. Then he heard it again, but this time it was closer. And it wasn't just one scream. It was multiple voices screaming in unison, overlapping, creating a cacophony of anguish that made his blood run cold. David grabbed his equipment and started back toward his car, walking quickly but trying not to panic. The locket was still in his hand. He'd been so startled by the screaming that he'd forgotten to put it back. As he walked, David became aware of movement in the forest around him, shapes flitting between trees, always at the edge of his vision. When he turns to look directly at them, there'd be nothing there. The temperature dropped suddenly. It had been a pleasant fall day, probably 55 degrees, but now David could see his breath. The forest around him seemed darker, as if clouds had covered the sun, but when he looked up, the sky was clear. David started running. Behind him, he could hear them now, footsteps, dozens of them, crashing through the undergrowth, and voices, not screaming anymore but whispering. David couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakably angry, accusatory. Something grabbed the back of his jacket. David spun around, swinging his detector like a weapon, but nothing was there. His jacket had a tear in it, though, 3 parallel gashes, like claw marks. He ran faster, abandoning any pretense of calm. His metal detector banged against his leg painfully. His digging pouch bounced wildly on his belt. The locket was clutched so tightly in his fist that the engraving was cutting into his palm. David burst out of the forest into the small clearing where he'd parked. Arthur's truck was already there, and the old man was standing beside David's car, his face pale. "Give it to me," Arthur said, holding out his hand. "Give me the locket." David opened his hand. Arthur took the locket carefully as if it were made of glass, then immediately threw it on the ground and stomped on it with his boot. Once, twice, 3 times, until the locket was crushed completely flat. The temperature immediately returned to normal. The darkness that had been creeping through the forest retreated. The sounds, the footsteps, the whispers, stopped instantly. Arthur picked up the crushed locket and looked at David with an expression that was equal parts anger and pity. David nodded, unable to speak. Arthur sat down heavily on his truck's tailgate. "Everyone opens it. That's why I've had to find it and destroy it 4 times in my life. It keeps coming back," David managed to ask. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Joshua and Jane Whitmore had 5 children. In 1843, all 5 died within a week. Fever, the records say. Typhoid or cholera, probably. Jane went mad with grief. She started doing things, dark things, trying to bring them back. Arthur looked at the crushed locket in his hand. Jane died in 1845. Some say she killed herself. Others say the town quietly hanged her for what she'd done. But before she died, she bound something to that locket, something that was supposed to call her children back. Instead, it called the settlement. David started. Burned in 1847, all of it. The surviving Whitmores insisted it was an accident, but family letters suggest otherwise. Things like that always survive. They want to survive. Arthur looked at David. David described the portrait and the hair that had moved. Arthur nodded. "The hair isn't from her children. We don't know whose hair it is, or even if it is hair at all. My father made me promise to check the property every few years to see if the locket had, worked its way back up. It usually takes 10 to 20 years. You're the 4th person I've had detect out here." He trailed off. David asked. "They all opened the locket. 2 of them didn't stop when I told them to. They kept digging in that area looking for more valuables. One disappeared entirely. We never found him, not even his car. The other one we found 3 days later, still on the property, sitting against a tree. He died of exposure, they said, but it was July and 80 degrees. There was no reason for him to freeze to death." David felt sick. "I destroy this locket, really destroy it this time. I'm going to melt it down, mix the metal with other scrap, make sure it can never reform into something recognizable, and you're going to promise me that you'll never come back to this property, never tell anyone else where it is." David nodded eagerly. "Done." Arthur stood up, pocketing the crushed locket. "Go home, David. Take a shower. Wash all your clothes. Sometimes they follow you, the things Jane called. But they can't follow you if you wash away the forest." It didn't. Not really, but David nodded anyway. He drove back to Burlington in a daze, went straight home, and did exactly as Arthur had instructed. He washed his clothes twice. He took a long, hot shower. He left all his detecting equipment in his garage, afraid to bring it inside. That night, David heard scratching at his bedroom window. When he looked, he saw nothing, but the next morning there were marks in the frost on the glass, 3 parallel lines like claw marks, right where he'd heard the scratching. David called Arthur. Arthur sighed. "I was afraid of that. Listen carefully. Go to your church. I don't care what denomination, any church. Tell the priest or minister that you need a blessing. You don't have to explain why. Then go home, Put salt lines across all your doorways and windowsills. Real salt, not the iodized stuff. The locket is destroyed. It can't maintain a hold on you without its anchor, but it's going to try for a few days. The blessing and salt will help for the locket to reform. It always does eventually. Maybe it'll take 50 years this time, maybe 100, but it'll come back. As David did everything Arthur told him to do, the scratching continued for 5 more nights, each time in a different location, windows, doors, even the walls. On the 6th night, it stopped completely. David hasn't been back to Whitmore Hollow. He still detects, but he's been very careful about where he hunts and what he digs up. When he finds something that feels wrong, and yes, sometimes objects do feel wrong, he leaves it in the ground. Arthur passed away in early 2022 from a heart attack, completely natural. Before he died, he called David one last time. I need you to promise me something. If you're still alive in 20 or 30 years, watch that property, find someone young, someone who detects, and tell them the story. Make sure the locket gets destroyed when it comes back. David promised he would, so here's the warning to metal detectorists. Not everything in the ground wants to stay buried. Some things are buried for a reason. If you find something that makes you uncomfortable, that gives you a bad feeling, trust your instincts. Leave it where it is. And if you ever find yourself detecting environment near a town called Chimney Point, and you come across old cellar holes in a place called Whitmore Hollow, walk away. There's nothing there worth finding, nothing except the locket, and trust the wisdom of those who came before. You don't want to find that. Thomas Broussard chose to use his real name when sharing this story. He was done hiding what happened to him. If someone out there knows about this, if someone can explain it, Thomas needs to know. Because 3 years later, he still can't sleep without the lights on. Thomas grew up in Houma, Louisiana, about 60 miles southwest of New Orleans. If you're not familiar with the area, it's prime bayou country. Vast wetlands, cypress swamps, countless waterways winding through dense vegetation. It's beautiful and peaceful and dangerous all at once. Kayak fishing in the bayou was Thomas's escape. He'd started doing it seriously around 2017, and by 2020, he was going out 3 or 4 times a week. There's something meditative about it. Just you, your kayak, the water, and whatever decides to bite your line. Thomas would pull in bass, catfish, redfish, sometimes even small sharks that had wandered up from the coast. The bayou he fished most regularly was near a tiny community called Petit Caillou, population maybe 200, most of them Cajun families who'd been there for generations. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew the good fishing spots. But there was one area that people avoided, a section of the bayou about 3 miles from the boat launch, where the channel narrowed and twisted through a especially dense swamp. The locals called it Dead Man's Turn, though no one could tell Thomas exactly why. Thomas had fished near it a few times, but never actually gone through the turn itself, not because he believed in local superstitions, but because the fishing was good enough in other areas that he never needed to venture that far. That changed in August of 2020. Thomas had been having a terrible fishing day, 8 hours on the water, and he'd caught exactly nothing, not even a bite. He was frustrated, hot, covered in mosquito bites, and about ready to call it quits. But he had 1 more hour before sunset, and he decided to try his luck at Dead Man's Turn. The paddle out there took about 40 minutes. As Thomas got closer, he noticed the water changing. It got darker, murkier, with a faint smell of decay. The cypress trees grew thicker here, their roots creating twisted shapes beneath the surface. Spanish moss hung so heavy on the branches that it formed curtains, blocking out much of the afternoon light. It was noticeably quieter, too. Thomas had been hearing birds and insects all day, the normal soundtrack of the bayou. But as he entered Dead Man's Turn, the sounds faded. Not completely silent, but muted. Wrong. Thomas cast his line into a promising spot beneath an overhanging cypress. Almost immediately, he got a hit, a strong pull that nearly yanked the rod out of his hands. This was a big fish. Really big. He started reeling, his kayak rocking as whatever was on the other end fought hard. It took Thomas 10 minutes to bring it close enough to see. When he finally got a glimpse of what he'd caught, his excitement turned to confusion. It wasn't a fish. It was a turtle, but not any species Thomas recognized. It was about 2 feet long, with a shell that was almost perfectly smooth and an unusual greenish-black color. Its head was disproportionately large, and when it looked at him, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. The turtle's eyes were wrong. They were too human-like, with an intelligence behind them that no turtle should possess. Thomas reached for his pliers to remove the hook, but before he could touch it, the turtle did something impossible. It opened its mouth and spoke. Thomas jerked his hand away, nearly capsizing his kayak. The turtle continued staring at him with those disturbingly human eyes. "This is not your place," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. The turtle didn't answer. Instead, it thrashed violently, snapping Thomas's line, and disappeared beneath the dark water. Thomas sat in his kayak, heart pounding, telling himself he'd imagined it. Heat stroke, dehydration, some kind of hallucination. Turtles don't talk. It was impossible. But then he heard the singing. It came from deeper in the swamp, beyond the turn. A woman's voice singing something that sounded like a lullaby, though the words weren't in any language Thomas recognized. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and deeply unsettling all at once. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming at him to paddle back the way he'd come, Thomas followed the sound. He navigated through Dead Man's Turn, the channel growing narrower. The cypress trees closed in overhead, their branches intertwining to form a tunnel. The water beneath him was so dark Thomas couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface. The singing grew louder. Thomas rounded a bend and found himself in a small clearing, a pool of relatively open water, maybe 50 feet across. In the center of the pool was a small island, just a hump of muddy ground, maybe 10 feet in diameter, with a single dead tree rising from it. And sitting beneath that tree, singing, was a woman. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it might have been a wedding gown, though it was stained with mud and torn in places. Her hair was long and dark, hanging wet against her shoulders. She sat with her back against the dead tree, her eyes closed, singing that strange lullaby. Thomas called out, "Are you okay?" She stopped singing. Slowly, she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. Thomas had seen a lot of things in the bayou, alligators, water moccasins, even a few black bears, but nothing had ever terrified him the way those eyes did. They were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just solid white like hard-boiled eggs. "You didn't listen," she said, her voice carrying easily across the water. I'm sorry, I can leave. I'll just..." "Too late now. You've seen." She stood up, and Thomas realized with horror that she was floating. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering about 6 inches above the muddy island. She asked, drifting closer to the water's edge. Thomas shook his head, unable to speak. "It's called the drowning pool. Every year it takes someone, sometimes intentionally, people who know what it offers." She stepped onto the water, not into it, onto it. She walked across the surface toward Thomas's kayak, her white dress trailing behind her like mist. "The water remembers everyone it takes. I'm one of 47. We all stay here, waiting, singing, calling." Thomas grabbed his paddle and started backing away, but his kayak wasn't responding properly. Something was wrong with the water. It had thickened, become viscous, like he was trying to paddle through honey. "You can't leave now," the woman said. She was 10 feet away, 5 feet, right beside Thomas's kayak. "Once you enter the drowning pool, you join us." She reached out toward him with one pale hand. Thomas swung his paddle at her, but it passed right through her arm as if she were made of smoke. That's when he felt it. Something grabbing his kayak from below, multiple hands, dozens of them emerging from the dark water. They grabbed the sides of his kayak, cold and slippery, pulling him down. The kayak started to tip. Water poured in over the side. Thomas tried to keep his balance, but more hands grabbed him, his legs, his arms, his shirt. They were pulling him into the water, into that dark pool where 47 bodies waited. Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He jumped. He kicked away from his kayak, away from the hands pulling him down, and swam with everything he had toward the channel he'd come from. The hands followed him, grasping at his feet, his clothes. Thomas felt fingers wrap around his ankle. He kicked hard, his shoe coming off in their grip, and kept swimming. Behind him, the woman was singing again, that same haunting lullaby. But now Thomas could hear other voices joining hers. Dozens of voices, maybe all 47 of them, singing in harmony. Thomas reached the channel and grabbed a cypress root, pulling himself forward, using the trees and roots to haul himself through the water faster than he could swim. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he didn't stop. The singing faded behind him. The hands stopped grabbing. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, Thomas burst out of Dead Man's Turn into the main bayou channel, where the water was clear and the sun was still shining. He didn't have his kayak. He didn't have his fishing gear. He'd lost a shoe, but he was alive. Thomas swam the 3 miles back to the boat launch. It took him over an hour, and by the time he dragged himself onto the dock, the sun had set and his wife had called the police, terrified because he hadn't come home. They found Thomas's kayak 2 days later, washed up about a mile downstream from Dead Man's Turn. It was crushed, like something enormous had stepped on it. His fishing rod was never recovered. Thomas told the police he'd capsized, lost his gear, and had to swim back. He didn't mention the woman or the hands or the singing. Who would believe that? But he told his wife, and she believed him because she knows the bayou. She knows there are places out there that don't follow normal rules. Her grandmother had told her stories about the drowning pool, about the spirits that live in certain parts of the swamp. Thomas hasn't been kayak fishing since. He can't. Every time he looks at dark water, he sees those white eyes. Every time he hears music, any music, he thinks he hears that lullaby underneath it, calling him back. About 6 months after Thomas's experience, a young couple from New Orleans came down to fish the bayou. They rented kayaks from the same place Thomas used to launch from. They were warned about Dead Man's Turn, but like Thomas, they didn't take the warning seriously. Only one of them came back. The woman made it to the boat launch just after dark, hysterical, saying her boyfriend had been pulled under by something in the water. They searched for 3 days but never found him. The official report said he drowned, probably got tangled in submerged roots. But the woman, Thomas met her briefly at a memorial service. She told him privately what really happened. She said they'd heard singing. She said a woman in a white dress had appeared. She said her boyfriend had frozen, staring at the woman, and then he just stepped off his kayak into the water, like he was in a trance, like he wanted to drown. She said when she'd finally gotten away, when she'd paddled out of that cursed stretch of bayou, she'd looked back and seen them, dozens of people standing in the water, up to their waists, all wearing old, rotted clothes, all singing. 48 now, Thomas supposed, one more added to the collection. If you fish or kayak in Louisiana, or really anywhere in the South where there are old waterways and forgotten swamps, listen to the locals. When they tell you to avoid a certain area, there's usually a reason. It might sound like superstition, it might sound like old wives' tales, but sometimes those tales exist because the alternative, the truth, is too terrible to believe. Dead Man's Turn is still there, the drowning pool is still waiting, and every year someone new ignores the warnings. Don't let it be you. Rebecca Torres, though she's changing some identifying details for legal reasons, experienced something in September of 2022 that would fundamentally change how she approached her hobby. The incident occurred in a small Pennsylvania town she'll call Iron Hill, one of those Rust Belt communities that boomed in the early 1900s and then slowly died as manufacturing moved overseas. The population now hovers around 3,000, down from nearly 30,000 in its heyday. Rebecca was 25 at the time, and she was deeply immersed in urban exploration, urbex, as practitioners call it. For those unfamiliar, it's essentially exploring abandoned buildings, factories, hospitals, schools, anything with history and decay. Rebecca documented everything on YouTube and Instagram, and she'd built up a decent following, about 50,000 subscribers who loved seeing these forgotten places. Iron Hill was perfect urbex territory. The whole town was littered with abandoned factories, most of them from the steel and manufacturing industries that had sustained the area for decades. Rebecca had been planning a trip there for months, and in early September, she finally made the 6-hour drive from her home in Maryland. She'd researched 5 different locations to explore, but there was one that kept coming up in urbex forums, the old Iron Hill Steelworks Factory No. 3. It had been closed since 1983, and according to online reports, it was mostly intact, equipment still in place, offices untouched, a real-time capsule. But there were warnings too. Several urbex explorers mentioned the feeling uneasy there. One wrote, "Didn't make it past the first floor." Another said, "Got some of the best photos of my career, but I'll never go back." That kind of comment always intrigued Rebecca, rather than scared her off. She figured people were just spooked by the normal creepiness of abandoned buildings. She should have listened to them. Rebecca arrived at the factory complex around 2 p.m. on a Saturday. The place was massive, 5 interconnected buildings, each 4 or 5 stories tall, sprawling across at least 10 acres. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but like most abandoned places, there were plenty of gaps where you could slip through. The main entrance to factory number 3 was partially boarded up, but Rebecca found a loading dock door that was unlocked. She pushed it open. It shrieked on rusted hinges and stepped inside. The first thing that hit her was the smell: rust, mold, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Slightly sweet, slightly rotten. The kind of smell that makes you breathe through your mouth. Rebecca turned on her camera and started her standard intro. Hey everyone, Rebecca here, and today we're exploring the Iron Hills Steelworks Factory, number 3. It really was. The factory floor was enormous, probably 200 feet long and 100 feet wide. Massive pieces of machinery still stood in rows: presses, furnaces, conveyor systems, all frozen in time. Afternoon sunlight streamed through broken windows high overhead, creating dramatic light beams through the dusty air. Rebecca spent the first hour photographing and filming the main floor, narrating for her viewers, getting establishing shots. Everything seemed normal. Great content, actually. This was going to be one of her best videos. Then she headed to the second floor. The stairwell was dark, Rebecca's flashlight beam cutting through blackness. The stairs themselves were steel grating, and they rang with each step she took. As she climbed, Rebecca noticed something odd. The temperature was dropping. The first floor had been warm, stuffy from being enclosed for decades, but the stairwell felt like a refrigerator. The second floor was offices and break rooms. Desks still had papers on them. A calendar on one wall was turned to March 1983, the month the factory closed. Someone's coffee mug sat on a windowsill, its contents long since evaporated, leaving a dark stain. Rebecca was filming a row of office cubicles when she heard it. Footsteps, heavy boots on metal stairs. Someone was coming up behind her. She spun around, her heart racing. "Hello?" The footsteps stopped. Rebecca waited, camera still rolling, for whoever it was to appear at the top of the stairs. No one came. She walked back to the stairwell and shined her light down. Empty. Just her own footprints in the thick dust on the stairs. "Okay," Rebecca said to her camera, trying to keep her voice steady. "That was weird. But old buildings make weird sounds, right?" She continued exploring the second floor, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That sensation of being watched, of someone just out of sight following her from room to room. In one of the break rooms, Rebecca found something that made her stop. Fresh boot prints in the dust. Not hers. These were bigger, heavier work boots, and they were fresh. The dust hadn't settled into them yet, meaning someone had been here recently, very recently. Rebecca called out again, "I'm just doing photography." No answer came. Rebecca decided to head to the third floor and then get out. This place was starting to feel wrong, exactly like those Urbex forum posts had described. The third floor was smaller than the second, mostly administrative offices and what looked like a quality control lab. Less interesting photographically, but Rebecca was committed to documenting each floor. That's where she found the photographs. They were pinned to a bulletin board in what had probably been a supervisor's office. Not old photographs from the 1980s, but new ones, recent ones. They were pictures of people, different ages, but all with one thing in common: they were urban explorers. Rebecca could tell by their gear, cameras, flashlights, the way they were dressed, and they were all taken inside this factory. Most chilling of all, in every photo, the person was alone, and they were looking directly at the camera, eyes wide, expressions terrified. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she looked at these images. There were at least 20 of them, 20 different people who'd been in this factory, who'd been photographed without their knowledge or permission by someone who'd been watching them. Rebecca grabbed her phone to call the police. No signal. Of course not. They were in an old steel building, basically a Faraday cage. That's when she heard the footsteps again, but this time they weren't behind her. They were above her, on the 4th floor, which made no sense because Rebecca had researched this building thoroughly. The 3rd floor was the top level of factory number 3. There was no 4th floor. She looked up. Above her, in the ceiling, was a hatch she hadn't noticed before. It was open, and she could see the bottom rungs of a ladder leading up into darkness. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, back and forth, like someone pacing. Rebecca should have left right then. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, but she was also cursed with curiosity. It's what made her a good urban explorer in the first place. And she couldn't help wondering, who was up there? Who'd been photographing all these people? Rebecca climbed the ladder. The fourth floor wasn't really a floor. It was the space beneath the roof, a narrow area maybe 5 feet high, forcing Rebecca to crouch. It was darker than anywhere else in the building, her flashlight beam barely penetrating the gloom, and it was full of stuff. Camping gear, sleeping bags, canned food, bottles of water. Someone was living here. Rebecca called out, her voice cracking. I don't want any trouble. Something moved in the darkness ahead of her, a shape human-sized, Ahmad, rising to a crouched position. The voice was male, rough, like someone who rarely spoke. Rebecca started backing toward the ladder. I'm an urban explorer. I photograph abandoned buildings. I didn't know anyone was living here. I'm sorry. He moved closer, staying just at the edge of Rebecca's flashlight beam so she couldn't see his face clearly. They come, they explore, they film, and then they leave, like this place is just entertainment for them. I'm sorry, Rebecca repeated, her hand finding the ladder behind her. His voice hardened. You'll stay. You'll understand what it's like to be forgotten. He lunged at Rebecca. She dropped her flashlight and scrambled down the ladder so fast she nearly fell. She could hear him coming after her, his heavy boots on the metal rungs. Rebecca ran through the third floor, her camera forgotten, just focused on getting to the stairs. Behind her, she could hear him crashing through the offices, knocking over furniture, getting closer. She hit the stairwell and took the stairs 3 at a time, her footsteps echoing like gunshots. Down to the second floor, down to the first. As Rebecca ran across the factory floor toward the loading dock exit, she risked a glance back. He was at the bottom of the stairs, silhouetted against the light from the upper floor. She couldn't see his face, but she could see that he was holding something. Her camera. Rebecca burst through the loading dock door into the late afternoon sunshine and didn't stop running until she reached her car. She drove straight to the Iron Hill police station. The officer who took her statement looked unsurprised. Factory number 3 again, he sighed. He called to another officer. You're the 8th, the second officer responded. Rebecca asked. The first officer nodded. Herman Kovac. He worked at that factory for 30 years before it closed. When they shut down, he didn't take it well. His whole identity was tied up in that place. He started living there, in the upper levels. We've tried to get him out, but he knows that building better than anyone. Off and on, he comes into town sometimes for supplies. We think he has money saved up somewhere. Then he disappears back into the factory. He's not violent exactly, but he's territorial. He has pictures, Rebecca said, of other urban explorers. The officers exchanged a look. We know, every few years we do a sweep, try to catch him. We've found his camps before, his photos, but he always knows we're coming and clears out. This is insane. It's complicated. The factory's privately owned, legal issues with forced removal, and honestly, he's not hurting anyone. The officer gave Rebecca a pointed look. Rebecca got the message. She'd been trespassing. Herman was crazy, but legally, she was the one in the wrong. Your camera's probably gone, the officer continued. He keeps them. We found probably 30 cameras and phones last time we searched his camp. Trophies, maybe. Rebecca never got her camera back. All her footage from that day was on it, including the section where you could hear those footsteps, where you could see those fresh boot prints. But here's what still haunts Rebecca. Before she left Iron Hill, she stopped at a local diner. The waitress, an older woman who'd probably lived there her whole life, asked what brought her to town. Urban exploration, Rebecca admitted. The waitress's expression darkened. Yeah. She refilled Rebecca's coffee. A place like that, it deserves respect. It's not just some ruin for you kids to take pictures of. People worked there. People lived and died there. And I mean that literally. 3 men died in accidents at that factory over the years. Their families lived in this town. She paused, looking out the window at the abandoned factory, visible in the distance. Herman's not right in the head, but maybe he's got a point. Rebecca left Iron Hill that evening and never went back. She still does urban exploration, but she's more careful now. She researches the history more thoroughly. She tries to be respectful. And when she hears stories about a place being inhabited or watched, she takes them seriously. Herman Kovac is still there, as far as anyone knows, still living in the abandoned factory, still photographing the urban explorers who ignore the warnings and venture into his home. If you're into urbex, be aware, not all abandoned buildings are empty. Sometimes they're home to people who never left, who couldn't let go. And sometimes those people aren't happy about visitors. Respect the places you explore, respect the history, and most importantly, respect the fact that for some people, these abandoned buildings are the only home they have left. Jennifer Caldwell, and yes, that's her real name because she wants people to know this happened, was 32 years old in the fall of 2021 when she discovered that some hobbies attract more than just enthusiasts. Sometimes they attract attention from things that should remain unobserved. Jennifer had been an amateur astronomer since childhood. She wasn't a professional by any means, but she had quality equipment, a Celestron Edge HD telescope worth about $3,000, a motorized mount for tracking celestial objects, cameras for astrophotography, the whole setup. Her specialty was deep sky imaging, nebulae, galaxies, star clusters, the kind of objects so distant their light has traveled millions of years to reach us. When Jennifer moved to Pinehurst in August 2021 for a remote software engineering job, she was thrilled to discover how dark the skies were. Pinehurst sits in the Cascade foothills, far from major cities with minimal light pollution. It's an astronomer's paradise. The local astronomy club, all 12 members of it, met monthly at the community center. During Jennifer's first meeting, an elderly man named Donald Marsh mentioned a location that made her eyes light up with excitement. "There's an old observatory site about 8 miles north of town," Donald explained. "Built in 1962 by some university, abandoned in the early 80s. The building's falling apart, but the concrete observation pad is still there, perfectly level, great sight lines to all horizons." Jennifer asked. The room went quiet. Several members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Donald cleared his throat. Equipment kept malfunctioning up there. Batteries would die even when fully charged. Electronics would glitch. He hesitated. "People reported seeing things through their telescopes," Jennifer pressed. "Lights moving wrong, objects that didn't match any satellite or aircraft patterns." Donald looked genuinely disturbed. "Shapes in deep space." Jennifer tried not to smile. She'd heard similar stories from amateur astronomers before, usually misidentified satellites, atmospheric phenomena, or lens artifacts. The human brain is wired to see patterns even when none exist, especially when staring into the vast darkness of space. "I'd love to check it out," Jennifer said. Donald drew her a map but warned her one final time. "Don't stay past midnight, and if you see something looking back at you through your scope, pack up immediately and leave. Don't try to understand it." Jennifer thanked him for the advice in the map, filed the warning under local superstition, and planned her first observation session for the following weekend when the new moon would provide the darkest skies. The drive to the old observatory site took Jennifer about 20 minutes up increasingly rough forest roads. The last half mile was barely more than a trail, forcing her to drive slowly to avoid damaging her car's undercarriage. She arrived just after sunset on a Saturday evening. The site was exactly as Donald had described, a clearing maybe 50 yards across, with the ruins of a small building on one side, just crumbling cinder block walls now, no roof, and a large concrete pad in the center. The pad was about 20 feet in diameter, perfectly level, designed for mounting large telescopes. The remains of old tracking equipment still jutted from the concrete. Rusted bolts, metal brackets, fragments of what had probably been a sophisticated motorized mount decades ago, but the pad itself was solid and level, ideal for Jennifer's setup. She spent the next hour assembling her equipment as darkness fell. The telescope went on its tripod, cameras attached, laptop connected for imaging. By 9 p.m., she was ready to begin observing. The sky was spectacular. With no moon and minimal light pollution, the Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of diamonds. Jennifer started with some easy targets: the Andromeda Galaxy, the Orion Nebula, the Pleiades star cluster. Her equipment worked perfectly, capturing beautiful images. Around 10:30, Jennifer decided to try for something more challenging: a distant galaxy cluster designated as Abell 2218, about 2 billion light-years away. She programmed the coordinates into her mount, and the telescope smoothly slewed to the target position. Jennifer looked through the eyepiece and frowned. Something was wrong with the image. Instead of the expected cluster of distant galaxies, she saw movement, lights that seemed to pulse and shift, as if something was moving between her telescope and the target. She assumed it was a satellite passing through her field of view. She waited for it to clear, but the movement continued. Not a straight line like a satellite would make, but a swirling, almost organic motion. Jennifer switched to a lower magnification eyepiece to get a wider field of view. The movement was more apparent now. Multiple points of light, dozens of them, moving in coordinated patterns. They were definitely not satellites, not aircraft, not anything Jennifer recognized from her years of astronomy. She grabbed her phone to take a video through the eyepiece. As soon as she started recording, her phone died. Complete battery death, even though it had been at 87% charge just moments before. Jennifer tried her laptop. It was also dead. The battery indicator showed 0%. Her backup battery pack, which she always kept fully charged, was also completely drained. Jennifer whispered. She looked through the eyepiece again. The lights were closer now, noticeably closer, and they were arranged in a pattern, a geometric shape that Jennifer's brain struggled to process because it seemed to have more dimensions than it should. Then, impossibly, one of the lights shifted. It moved from the background, billions of light years away, to the foreground. It was suddenly close, very close. Jennifer jerked back from the eyepiece, her heart hammering. When she looked back through, the light had moved even closer. It was no longer in deep space. It was somewhere in Earth's atmosphere, maybe even nearby. She looked up from the telescope, scanning the night sky with her naked eyes. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just stars, just the familiar constellations. Then she noticed them, 7 lights hovering in a perfect heptagon formation about 30 degrees above the horizon. They weren't stars. They were too bright, too steady, and they definitely hadn't been there before. As Jennifer watched, the lights began to move. They maintained their geometric formation but started descending, coming lower, coming closer. Jennifer's rational mind was screaming that this was impossible. These had to be drones, aircraft, something explainable. But she'd been watching the sky long enough to know what aircraft looked like, what satellites looked like, what drones looked like. These were none of those things. The lights descended to perhaps 500 feet above the forest surrounding the clearing. They were close enough now that Jennifer could see they weren't points of light but rather spheres, each maybe 6 feet in diameter, glowing with a soft white luminescence that didn't seem to illuminate anything around them. And they were watching her. Jennifer couldn't explain how she knew, but she felt it with absolute certainty. These things, whatever they were, had her attention, and they were studying her with the same intensity she'd been using to study them. One of the spheres broke formation and drifted closer to the clearing. It stopped about 50 feet away, hovering at treetop level. Jennifer could see now that its surface wasn't smooth but rippled, like looking at an object through disturbed water. Jennifer started frantically disassembling her equipment, her hands shaking. She unscrewed the cameras from her telescope, collapsed the tripod, threw everything into her equipment cases without her usual care. As she worked, the sphere drifted closer, 30 feet away, 20 feet. It made no sound, created no wind, but Jennifer could feel something emanating from it, a pressure in her head, like someone was trying to push their way into her thoughts. Images flashed through Jennifer's mind, not her memories, but something else. She saw a vast structure in space, geometric and wrong, violating physics in ways her brain couldn't process. Other worlds, other skies, other beings looking up at stars that weren't the ones Jennifer knew. A network of watchers scattered across the galaxy, monitoring and documenting everything that evolved, everything that developed the ability to look back at them. And she saw herself from outside, from above, as if through the perspective of the things studying her. She saw herself as they saw her, a curious creature staring into depths it couldn't comprehend, attracting attention it wasn't ready for. Jennifer screamed. The images stopped immediately. The sphere retreated 10 feet, as if startled by her reaction. She grabbed her telescope case and her equipment bag and ran for her car. Behind her, all 7 spheres descended into the clearing, circling her telescope mount, which she'd left behind in her panic. Jennifer threw her equipment in the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat. Her car's dashboard lit up, then immediately went dark. The engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. Through her windshield, Jennifer watched the spheres examining her abandoned equipment. They seemed particularly interested in the telescope, drifting around it, the rippling surfaces of the spheres touching the lenses. One sphere lifted the entire telescope mount off the ground. It hung suspended in the air, rotating slowly as the spheres examined it from all angles. Then, impossibly, the telescope began to disintegrate. not breaking apart violently, but carefully dissolving, piece by piece, component by component, as if the spheres were carefully studying its construction. Within 60 seconds, her $3,000 telescope, her cameras, everything she'd left on the mount, it was all gone, not destroyed, but deconstructed down to atomic components, scattered as dust. The spheres turned their attention to Jennifer's car. They drifted closer. Jennifer could see them through her windshield, their rippling surfaces pressing against the glass. The pressure in her head returned, stronger now, insistent. They wanted in, into her car, into her mind. They wanted to understand her the same way they'd understood her telescope, by carefully taking her apart and examining each component. Jennifer did the only thing she could think of. She started praying, not because she was particularly religious, but because it was the only defense she had against something so utterly beyond human comprehension. She prayed loudly, desperately, her voice filling the car's interior. The Lord's Prayer, then the only other prayer she could remember from childhood church services, then just pleading, begging, crying for help from God, from the universe, from anything that might be listening besides these things. And they stopped. The spheres retreated from her car. They rose quickly into the sky, reforming their heptagon formation, and then, in an instant so fast Jennifer almost missed it, they were gone, not flying away, but simply ceasing to exist in this space, as if they'd stepped sideways into a dimension Jennifer couldn't perceive. Jennifer sat in her car, sobbing, for maybe 5 minutes. Then she tried the engine again. This time, it started immediately. The battery gauge showed 100% charge. She drove back to Pinehurst in a daze, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She went straight to Donald Marsh's house. He'd given her his address at that first astronomy club meeting, saying she could call any time if she needed advice, and Donald answered at his door at 11:40 p.m., looking completely unsurprised to see her. He said quietly, "It was only 10:30 when they showed up," Jennifer whispered. Donald went pale. "They came early? They've never come before midnight. You must have... Did you look at something you shouldn't have?" Jennifer told him about Able 2218, about the lights she'd seen moving in deep space, about the spheres descending. Donald nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected for years. Able 2218, that's a galaxy cluster 2 billion light years away. But here's what most people don't know. When you look at something 2 billion light years away, you're looking 2 billion years into the past. I don't understand what that has to do with... What if something there, 2 billion years ago, developed the ability to look back? Not at when we are now, but at when we would be. What if they've been watching us all along, waiting for us to develop the technology to look at them? Jennifer felt sick. Is it? You saw them. They came when you looked at that specific region of space. It's happened before, Jennifer. 4 times that I know of. Other amateur astronomers who set up at that site, who pointed their telescopes at certain deep sky objects. 3 of them left Pinehurst immediately afterward and never came back. Donald's expression darkened. The 4th kept going back, kept trying to observe them again, kept trying to understand. They found his equipment at the site 3 weeks later. The telescope was disassembled, carefully taken apart and arranged in a pattern on the concrete pad. But Charles was gone. Why didn't you tell me this? I did tell you. I warned you not to stay past midnight. I told you if you saw something looking back, leave immediately. You're young, Jennifer. I thought you'd be careful. Jennifer asked. I don't know. No one knows. Astronomers across the world have reported similar encounters, but it gets dismissed as UFO nonsense. The scientific community won't touch it. But I've talked to enough people over the years, heard enough similar stories. There are things out there that notice when we notice them. Jennifer never returned to the observatory site. She didn't even try to retrieve the equipment she'd left in her panic. It was gone anyway, disintegrated by those things. She continued doing astronomy, but she changed her approach entirely. She now only observes objects within our solar system. Planets, the moon, asteroids, comets, nothing beyond our local neighborhood, nothing deep in space, nothing that might be looking back. And she never, ever points her telescope at Able 2218 again. 3 months after Jennifer's experience, another astronomer joined the Pinehurst Astronomy Club, a young man, eager and enthusiastic, who'd just bought his first serious telescope. At his second meeting, he mentioned that he'd been researching observation sites and found an old abandoned observatory north of town that looked perfect. Donald Marsh tried to warn him. So did Jennifer. So did the other longtime members of the club. The young man smiled and assured them he'd be careful. He was an engineer, he said. He didn't believe in superstitions. He'd be fine. They found his telescope at the site 1 week later. It had been carefully disassembled, each component arranged in a perfect spiral pattern on the concrete pad. His cameras were there too, laid out in geometric precision. But the young man was gone. No trace, no sign of struggle, just gone. His disappearance made the local news, but the official investigation concluded he'd probably wandered off into the forest and gotten lost. The carefully arranged equipment was attributed to unknown persons who'd vandalized the site after his disappearance. But the members of the Pinehurst Astronomy Club knew better. They knew what happens when you look too deeply into places that something else calls home, when you make eye contact with things that have been watching and waiting. The observatory site is still there. The concrete pad is still level and perfectly positioned for stargazing. The skies above it are still dark and clear, but the Pinehurst Astronomy Club doesn't meet there anymore. They observe from their backyards, from local parks, from anywhere except that cursed clearing 8 miles north of town, because some things are meant to remain unobserved. Some regions of space should be left alone, and some hobbies, innocent as they seem, can attract attention from places so distant and alien that human minds break trying to comprehend them. If you're an amateur astronomer, if you love pointing telescopes at the deep sky and marveling at the universe's vastness, just remember, space is big, really big, and not all of it is empty. Some of it is watching, waiting, hoping you'll look directly at it. And if you ever feel something looking back when you peer through your eyepiece, if your equipment starts malfunctioning without cause, if you see lights moving in patterns that violate every law of physics, don't try to understand it. Don't try to observe it more closely. Don't try to make contact. Just pack up your equipment and leave immediately, before they decide you're interesting enough to study more carefully, before they decide to take you apart, piece by piece, to understand how you work, just like they did to Jennifer's telescope, just like they did to Charles, just like they did to that young engineer whose name the club members can barely bring themselves to say anymore. The universe is vast and full of wonders, but some of those wonders are better left unobserved. 6 stories, 1 town, 140 minutes of terror. Pinehurst, Washington. Population 1,847, a town where Trail 19 claims hikers who ignore red markers, where the abandoned logging town of Ghostwood captures you through photographs, where silver lockets call to things that should never be called, where the north end of the lake holds 34 souls in its depths, where a man guards his sawmill home against those who would turn it into entertainment. This is Bare Facts Docs. We don't just tell you horror stories. We take you deep into places where terror concentrates, where entire communities hold dark secrets, where the warnings are real and ignoring them can cost you everything. If you survive these 2 hours with us, if you made it through the forests and ghost towns and cursed objects and drowning pools and abandoned mills of Pinehurst, then you're ready for what's coming next. Because Pinehurst isn't the only town in America hiding nightmares. Subscribe to Bare Facts Docs and hit that notification bell. We're bringing you more small-town terror, more connected stories, more places where the darkness pools and waits. Next time, we're traveling south, to Louisiana Bayou Country, to a town called Ashwood, where the swamps hold secrets older than America itself, where voodoo isn't just history, where the water remembers, where 5 more people learn that some hobbies come with a price. That's coming soon. If you have a story from Pinehurst or from your own cursed hometown, share it in the comments below. Your warning might save someone's life. This has been Bare Facts Docs. Remember, the scariest stories are the ones that actually happen. Stay safe out there and stay connected for the terror yet to come.